In the autumn of 1964, 7 people watched the most important fight in Bruce Lee's life. 7 witnesses, no cameras, no recordings, no photographs. And when it was over, every single one of them told a different story. 60 years later, nobody agrees on what happened in that room. And the reason nobody agrees is the most interesting part of the story. This is the fight that made Bruce Lee who he was. And it might be the fight he never fully won. To understand what happened in that room in Oakland in the autumn of 1964, you have to understand the world Bruce Lee was living in at the time, because the fight did not begin the night it was fought. It began months earlier with a series of decisions that Bruce made that the people around him found deeply offensive. Bruce Lee had opened his second martial arts school in Oakland, California in 1964. He was 23 years old, already known in martial arts circles as someone exceptional, fast, precise, intellectually serious about his craft in a way that most martial artists of his generation were not. He had trained under the legendary Ip Man in Hong Kong. He had spent years developing and refining his approach to fighting, stripping away what he saw as the theatrical and traditional elements that had accumulated around Kung Fu over centuries, and leaving only what actually worked. And he was teaching it to anyone who wanted to learn, not just Chinese students, white students, black students, students of every background who showed up at his school, paid their fees, and were willing to work. This was, in the martial arts community of San Francisco's Chinatown in 1964, a significant transgression. The tradition was clear. Chinese martial arts were for Chinese people. The knowledge was an inheritance, not a commodity. Sharing it with outsiders was, to the traditionalists, a form of betrayal. Bruce Lee did not agree. He had said publicly, with characteristic bluntness, that martial arts belonged to anyone willing to learn them seriously. He had also, in a demonstration at the Sun Sing Theater in San Francisco's Chinatown, gone considerably further. He had stood on that stage and called San Francisco's Kung Fu grandmasters old tigers with no teeth. He had derided traditional Chinese martial arts styles as ineffective, outdated, and riddled with techniques that sounded impressive in demonstration and failed completely in real fighting. He had done this in front of an audience that included some of the most respected teachers in the Chinese martial arts community. The provocation was not accidental. Bruce Lee had been sharpening this argument for years. He had grown up watching Kung Fu practiced as ceremony rather than combat, beautiful, codified, reverential toward tradition in a way that he found fundamentally dishonest. He believed that a fighting system that did not actually work in a real fight was not a fighting system at all, regardless of how many centuries it had been practiced or how many grandmasters had certified its legitimacy. He had tested this belief in the street fights of his Hong Kong youth, in the informal challenge matches he had accepted since coming to America, in the private sessions where he sparred with anyone willing to push him. His conclusions were consistent. Most of what was being taught and celebrated in the traditional Kung Fu world was, in his words, a classical mess. Saying this privately was one thing. Standing on a stage in the heart of the community most invested in what he was dismissing and saying it publicly was something else entirely. It was either the act of a man so confident in his position that he felt no need for tactical restraint, or the act of a young man whose confidence exceeded his judgment about when to deploy it. Possibly both. The reaction was not positive. David Chin, a Wing Chun enthusiast and community figure, decided that what Bruce Lee needed was not a debate, but a demonstration of the consequences of his attitude. He knew a martial artist named Wong Jack Man, who had recently arrived in San Francisco from Hong Kong. He was 23 years old, the same age as Bruce, and was a practitioner of 3 distinct Chinese martial arts styles: Northern Shaolin, Xing Yi Quan, and Tai Chi. He was taller than Bruce, quieter, more reserved, and by all accounts completely without the ego and provocativeness that had made Bruce so many enemies in the community. And he was also, by every measure available to the people who trained him, genuinely formidable. Chin approached Wang with a proposition. He suggested that Wang could give Bruce Lee the dose of humility that the community felt he deserved, that a formal challenge match would settle the question of whether Bruce's dismissals of traditional kung fu were backed by the ability to defeat one of its genuine practitioners. Wang agreed. A letter was composed and delivered to Bruce.
The conditions were discussed and negotiated. Wang wanted a public fight, an open match witnessed by the community that would produce a clear public result. Bruce refused this. He would only fight in private. The reasons for this are interpreted differently by different people. Some say he was protecting himself from the reputational risk of losing publicly. Others say he was protecting his opponent from the humiliation of a public defeat. What is certain is that Bruce's insistence on privacy meant that whatever happened that night would be filtered through the memories of a small group of people rather than witnessed directly by anyone with a stake in one outcome or the other. The fight was arranged at Bruce's school on Broadway Avenue in Oakland. On a late autumn evening in 1964, 6 people drove from San Francisco's Chinatown across the Bay Bridge to Oakland. Among them was Wong Jack Man, accompanied by David Chin and several others. Bruce was waiting. The doors were locked. 7 people would witness what happened next. This is where the story becomes, in the word of one historian who studied it extensively, a real-life Rashomon. Bruce Lee's wife, Linda, was present. Her account, recorded in her biography of her husband published in 1975, describes a fight that lasted approximately 3 minutes. In her telling, Bruce attacked immediately and overwhelmingly. Wong tried to defend but was pushed back, and then, in an account that is vivid and specific, turned and ran. Bruce chased him and brought him to the floor, pounding him until Wong pleaded for the fight to stop. Bruce demanded a clear verbal surrender, asking twice to make certain there was no ambiguity before he released him. The fight was decisive. It was over quickly. The result was not in doubt. There is something important to note about Linda Lee's account. She was 20 years old at the time, deeply in love with her husband, and watching him in a fight that had serious consequences for his livelihood and his reputation. She was not a neutral observer. This does not mean she was lying. It means her memory of that night was filtered through the emotional state of someone who needed a specific outcome to be true. Psychologists who study eyewitness testimony have documented extensively that memory is not a recording, but a reconstruction, and that the reconstruction is shaped powerfully by what the witness needed or feared. Wong Jack Man's account is almost unrecognizable as a description of the same event. In his version, the fight lasted 20 to 25 minutes. He describes Bruce coming at him with the aggression of, in his words, a wild bull, headlong, relentless, making no attempt at defense. Wong fought primarily defensively, not wanting to inflict serious injury on an opponent who showed no signs of stopping. He describes being fully capable of hurting Bruce throughout the fight, but choosing restraint because the consequences of seriously injuring another martial artist were ones he wanted to avoid. The fight ground on for what felt like a very long time and ended not with a clear victory for either man, but with both of them exhausted, unable to continue, the fight simply stopping rather than concluding.
Wong's account also has to be understood in context. He is a man whose version of events was publicly dismissed and contradicted for decades, who watched his opponent become one of the most famous human beings on earth while he remained unknown outside the martial arts community. He had strong motivations, conscious or otherwise, to remember the fight in a way that preserved his dignity. Again, this does not mean he was lying. It means that what 7 people remember about a 25-minute physical confrontation that happened 60 years ago is inevitably shaped by everything they brought to it and everything they needed from it afterward. David Chin, who had arranged the match on Wong's behalf and was present throughout, gave an account that aligned more closely with Linda's version in certain details and with Wong's in others. He confirmed that Bruce had launched an immediate and aggressive attack. He said that Wong had turned his back and attempted to move away, which he attributed not to flight but to a defensive strategy of creating distance. He described Bruce chasing Wong around the room until Wong tripped and fell, at which point Bruce jumped on top of him and continued striking until Chin himself had to intervene to end the fight. William Chen, a Tai Chi teacher who was the only neutral party in the room, gave perhaps the most restrained assessment. He said both men were very, very good. He said the fight lasted approximately 20 minutes. He declined to declare a winner. The morning after the fight, a martial arts promoter named Ming Lum ran into Wong Jack Man at the Jackson Cafe in Chinatown, where Wong worked as a waiter. Wong showed up to work and completed his shift. When Lum examined him, the only visible evidence of the previous night's fight was a small scratch above one of his eyes. Lum, who had been friends with both men and had chosen not to attend the fight because he feared someone would be seriously hurt, looked at Wong and said, "Some people say Bruce Lee beat you up badly, but if he had, you would not be here today." Bruce Lee's own account of the fight, given in an interview without naming his opponent directly, is the most revealing of all, because it is not a victory speech. He described chasing a running opponent. He described punching the man behind the head and in the back. He described his own fists swelling from hitting the man's skull. And then he said, "Right then I realized Wing Chun was not too practical." Read that carefully. This is Bruce Lee describing the most important fight of his life, and what he is describing is a man who lost control of the engagement, chased a retreating opponent, hurt his own hands, and walked away believing that the system he had been trained in was not good enough. Whatever the scoreboard said, whoever you believe won, Bruce Lee's own internal verdict on that night was that something had failed.
That failure became the most productive moment of his life. In the months following the fight, Bruce Lee dismantled and rebuilt his entire approach to martial arts from the ground up. He discarded the limitations of Wing Chun. He began absorbing boxing, wrestling, fencing, and anything else that contained genuine physical truth rather than ceremonial tradition. He began developing what he would eventually call Jeet Kune Do, a system specifically designed to have no system, a style designed to have no style, built around the principle that the only thing that mattered in a real fight was what actually worked against a real opponent who was genuinely trying to hurt you. The fight with Wong Jack Man, whatever its outcome, had shown Bruce Lee that his current tools were not adequate to the challenge of a determined opponent. He spent the rest of his life building better ones. Wong, for his part, did something that Bruce Lee could never quite manage. He stayed quiet. After the fight, a war of words played out in the Chinese-language newspapers of San Francisco, with both men writing accounts that claimed vindication. Bruce eventually stopped responding. He closed his Oakland school and relocated to Los Angeles, where the path toward Hollywood would eventually open. Wong stayed in the Bay Area. He taught Northern Shaolin at the Fort Mason Center and at the First Unitarian Church in Oakland for the better part of 50 years, training thousands of students, quietly building one of the longest and most respected teaching careers in American martial arts history. He gave his first public account of the fight in 1980, 16 years after it happened. He died in December 2018 at the age of 77. Very few people outside the martial arts community noticed. The contrast between the two trajectories is, in its way, another kind of answer to the question of what happened in that room. Bruce Lee became a global icon, a name that is still spoken with reverence 50 years after his death, a face that is still recognized on every continent. Wong Jack Man became a Grand Master, quietly and without fanfare, known and respected by the people who sought him out and trained with him and were changed by him, invisible to the world that had made his opponent immortal.
Who won? The honest answer is that we do not know. Every person in that room had reasons, conscious or otherwise, to remember the fight in the way they remembered it. Linda loved her husband. David Chin had arranged the challenge on Wang's behalf. William Chen preferred traditional styles to Bruce's more iconoclastic approach. Wang himself had a reputation and a dignity to protect. And Bruce's own account, stripped of pride and bravado, reads like the testimony of a man who had been pushed harder than he expected and had drawn the right conclusions from that experience. What we know is this: 7 people watched the most important fight in Bruce Lee's life. None of them agreed on what they saw. Bruce Lee walked out of that room and changed everything about how he understood fighting. And the man he fought outlived him by 45 years, teaching quietly in the city where it all began, never claiming victory, never denying what he knew. The fight lasted 3 minutes, or it lasted 25. Bruce won, or nobody did. The doors were locked, and the cameras never came, and the only record that exists is the one that began the next morning, when a man showed up to his shift at a Chinatown restaurant with a small scratch above his eye and an entire life still ahead of him. Tell us in the comments, who do you think won? Subscribe and share this video with someone who thinks they know the full story of Bruce Lee. Because the most important fight of his life is the one that history still cannot explain.